October 24th, 1944, 5:31 in the morning, Palawan Passage, Philippine Sea. Admiral Takeshi Yamada stood on the bridge of the heavy cruiser IJN Akatsuki, his fingers wrapped around a small photograph. The edges were worn soft from handling. His wife Akiko smiled back at him from their garden in Tokyo. Beside her, their daughter Yuki, 14 years old, wearing the school uniform she was so proud of, and Kenji, their son, 12, grinning with a gap where he'd lost a tooth playing baseball. Yamada had looked at this photograph every morning for 6 months, every morning since he'd left Tokyo, every morning wondering if it would be the last time. This morning it was. He had 60 seconds left, 60 seconds before 6 American torpedoes would tear his flagship apart, 60 seconds before 360 of his men would begin their descent into darkness, 60 seconds before the most powerful Japanese naval force since Midway would lose 20% of its strength in less than half an hour. But Admiral Yamada didn't know any of this yet. All he knew was that something felt wrong. The sea was too quiet, the darkness too complete, the air too still. He tucked the photograph back into his uniform pocket right over his heart and returned his gaze to the horizon. Dawn was coming. The eastern sky showed the first pale hints of light, that deep blue that comes just before sunrise. In an hour, the sun would be up. In 2 hours, they would clear the Palawan Passage and be in open water. In 3 days, they would reach Leyte Gulf. If they lived that long, 4,200 meters below where Yamada stood, there would soon be a graveyard. A steel coffin the size of a city block holding 360 souls who had only minutes left to live. But right now, at this exact moment, everything seemed normal. The fleet moved at 18 knots, fast enough to reach their objective, slow enough to maintain formation. 5 battleships in the center, each one a floating fortress of steel and fire. 12 heavy cruisers flanking them. 15 destroyers prowling the edges like wolves protecting the pack. This was the center force, the hammer that would smash through American defenses at Leyte Gulf, the last great throw of the dice for the Imperial Japanese Navy. But they had one fatal flaw. No air cover, not a single fighter plane, not a single scout aircraft. Every Japanese carrier had been sunk or stripped of its pilots. The skies belonged to America now, so the fleet sailed blind, deaf, vulnerable. And 10 miles away, 2 American submarines had been watching them all night long. What would happen when 360 men realized they had less than 30 minutes to live? Some would fight the water flooding into their compartments, desperate to seal the doors, to stop the ocean from claiming them. Some would pray, clutching photographs of their own families, whispering final words that no one would ever hear. Some would make choices that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. But to understand how we got here to this precise moment at 5:31 in the morning, we need to go back 3 days. Back to when this mission was born. Back to when Admiral Takeshi Yamada received the orders that would seal his fate. This is the story of 28 minutes, the 28 minutes it took for a 13,400-ton warship to sink beneath the waves. The 28 minutes that changed everything for 2 nations locked in the deadliest war in human history. It's the story of Admiral Takeshi Yamada, who would survive but never forgive himself. Of Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka trapped in an engine room with water rising past his chest, forced to choose between his friend and his life. Of Commander David Harrison, the American submarine captain, who had already killed 300 Allied prisoners by mistake and was now aiming 6 torpedoes at the largest target of his career. And of the decision made 3 days earlier that doomed 360 men before they even left port. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. If you served in the Pacific during World War II, or if your father or grandfather did, leave a comment below. Tell us where you served, what you remember. What stories stayed with you, the ones you could never forget? Because this isn't just history. This is about the men who were there, the decisions they made in the space of a heartbeat, the prices they paid for the rest of their lives. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why one American submarine commander, a former school teacher from Ohio, would wake up in cold sweats for the next 40 years, seeing the faces of men drowning in darkness 4,000 meters below the surface. This is the untold story of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and it begins 3 days before those torpedoes found their mark. October 1944. The war in the Pacific had reached its critical phase. For 3 years since Pearl Harbor, Japan and America had been locked in a brutal campaign across thousands of miles of ocean. Island after island purchased with American blood. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan. Each victory pushing Japan closer to its home islands. Each defeat making the inevitable conclusion clearer. Now General Douglas MacArthur was making good on his promise. I shall return. The target was the Philippines. Retake them, and Japan's supply lines would be severed. The war would be all but over. Japan knew this. And they were willing to gamble everything on one last desperate throw. They called it Operation SHO-1, SHO meaning victory. It was a plan born not of confidence but of desperation. This is where Admiral Takeshi Yamada enters our story. 55 years old in October 1944, a career naval officer who had joined the Imperial Japanese Navy when he was 19. He'd seen action at Pearl Harbor where the war began, at Midway where Japan's momentum broke, at Guadalcanal where so many of his friends had died in the green hell of the Solomon Islands. By 1944, Yamada was tired. Tired of war, tired of losing, tired of writing letters to widows, tired of lying to his wife every time he called home to Tokyo. But he was a samurai, or at least he tried to be. And samurai do not question orders. On October 21, 1944, at the Japanese naval base in Brunei, Yamada received the orders that would change everything. He stood in the operations room, surrounded by maps of the Philippine Sea, listening to his superior officer outline the plan. The orders were simple, in concept, suicidal in execution. Take the center force. 5 battleships, including the mighty Yamato and Musashi, the largest battleships ever built. 12 heavy cruisers, 15 destroyers. Sail east through the Palawan Passage, break through to Leyte Gulf, destroy the American landing fleet, no matter the cost. Yamada read the typed orders. Then he read them again. Then he looked up at his superior officer and said 5 words that would echo in his mind for the next 33 years. This is a suicide mission. The room went quiet. Other officers looked away. You didn't question orders. You didn't voice doubts. Not in the Imperial Japanese Navy, not in 1944. But Yamada was 55 years old and had survived 3 years of war. He'd earned the right to speak plainly. We have no air cover. Yamada continued. The Americans control the skies. They'll know we're coming before we're halfway there. Their planes will tear us apart. His superior officer, a rear admiral named Kurosawa, nodded slowly. He was older than Yamada, nearly 60, with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. You are correct, Admiral Yamada. This is likely a suicide mission. But it is also our only chance. If we do nothing, we lose the Philippines. If we lose the Philippines, we lose the war. At least this way, we die fighting. We die with honor. And then Kurosawa said the words that made refusal impossible. This is the Emperor's will. Bushido does not permit doubt. Yamada felt something break inside him at those words. Not his resolve, not his courage, but his hope. The small secret hope that maybe somehow he would survive this war. That he would see Tokyo again. That he would watch his children grow up. That hope died in the operations room in Brunei on October 21st, 1944. Yes, sir, Yamada said quietly. We will carry out the mission. That night, October 21st, Admiral Yamada did something he had never done before in 3 years of war. He called home. The phone lines from Brunei to Tokyo were notoriously unreliable. Military calls got priority, but personal calls could take hours to connect. Sometimes they didn't connect at all. The operators would shrug and suggest you try again tomorrow. Tomorrow, when you might be dead. Yamada waited in the communications room for 90 minutes. He sat on a metal chair in a concrete building that smelled of diesel fuel and cigarette smoke, listening to static on the line, waiting for a miracle. At 11:47 p.m., the line finally crackled to life. Hello, it was Akiko, his wife of 28 years. Her voice sounded so far away, like she was calling from another world, which in a way she was. She was calling from a world of gardens and school uniforms and baseball games. He was in a world of warships and death. Akiko, he said. It's me, Takeshi. Her voice brightened immediately. Oh, I'm so glad you called. I've been thinking about you every day. Are you well? Are you eating properly? You know how you get when you're busy. You forget to eat. Yamada smiled despite everything. Even now, even across thousands of miles of ocean and war, she was worried about whether he was eating enough. "I'm fine," he said. The lie came easily. He'd had 3 years of practice. "How are you? How are the children?" They talked for 6 minutes. That's all the military exchange would allow for personal calls. 6 minutes to compress 28 years of marriage, 2 children, a lifetime of shared moments. Akiko told him Yuki had gotten the highest marks in her class in mathematics. Yamada said he was proud. It was the truth. Yuki had always been brilliant. She told him Kenji kept asking when Daddy would come home. The boy wanted to show his father the new baseball glove one of his uncles had given him. Wanted to play catch in the garden. And that's when Yamada's voice broke. Soon, he told her. "I'll be home soon, next month. I promise." It was the last thing he ever lied to his wife about. Because Admiral Takeshi Yamada knew, even as he said the words, that he would probably never see Tokyo again. Never see his children grow up. Never hold Akiko in his arms. Never play catch with Kenji in the garden. The silence on the line lasted 10 seconds. 10 seconds where both of them knew the truth, but neither would say it. Saying it would make it real, would make it inevitable. Finally, Akiko spoke. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the tears underneath. "I love you, Takeshi. I love you too." Click. The line went dead. Yamada sat in the communications room for another 20 minutes holding the dead receiver, listening to the dial tone. Then he stood up, straightened his uniform, and walked back to his quarters to pack his belongings. He would never speak to his wife again. While Admiral Yamada was saying goodbye to his family, Commander David Harrison was 800 miles away, prowling beneath the surface of the Palawan Passage. Harrison was 34 years old. Before the war, he'd been a high school mathematics teacher in Columbus, Ohio. He taught algebra and geometry to teenagers who would rather be playing baseball or chasing girls. He was good at it, patient, clear. He could make calculus make sense to kids who thought they'd never use it. Then Pearl Harbor happened. Harrison enlisted the day after, stood in line at the recruiting office for 3 hours with 100 other men, all of them angry and all of them ready to fight. Within a year, he'd completed submarine school at New London, Connecticut. Within 18 months, he had his own command. USS Swordfish, a Gato-class submarine, 311 feet long, crew of 80 men. In the 18 months since taking command, Harrison had sunk 4 Japanese cargo ships. Good kills. Clean kills. Ships carrying war supplies, ammunition, fuel. Not people, just materials. But there was one kill that kept him awake at night. January 1943, South China Sea. USS Swordfish detected a large transport ship on radar. No destroyer escort, no identification, just a big, slow target moving through Japanese-controlled waters. Harrison had made the calculation quickly. Large transport, Japanese waters, had to be carrying war materials, maybe troops. Either way, a legitimate target. He fired 4 torpedoes. All 4 hit. The ship went down in 7 minutes. Only later, 3 days later, did they intercept a Japanese radio transmission. The ship had been carrying 300 Allied prisoners of war. British, Australian, American. Men who had survived the fall of Singapore survived months in Japanese POW camps, being transferred to a new location. Harrison's torpedoes had killed them all. Officially, it was classified as a regrettable error of war. No court-martial. No punishment. These things happen in war. Mistakes were inevitable. Unintentional casualties were part of the cost of fighting. But Harrison knew the truth. He had killed 300 of his own people. 300 men who had survived hell only to die by American torpedoes. He wrote their names in his journal. Every single name obtained from intelligence reports. 300 names. He read them every night before he went to sleep. A kind of penance. A kind of prayer. That was the burden Commander David Harrison carried into the pre-dawn darkness of October 24th, 1944. That was the weight on his shoulders when his radar operator suddenly called out from the forward compartment, "Captain, multiple large contacts bearing 310 degrees range 30,000 yards. It was 12:16 a.m., October 24th. Harrison was in his bunk when the call came. He was on the bridge in 30 seconds, still buttoning his shirt. The radar screen glowed green in the darkness, and there they were. Not 2 or 3 contacts, not 5. At least 20, maybe 30. Large contacts, moving east at steady speed. Sir, the radar operator whispered, those aren't cargo ships. Look at the speed. Look at the formation. That's a battle fleet. Harrison's heart rate doubled. His mouth went dry. He'd spent 18 months hunting cargo ships and small escorts. Now the biggest Japanese fleet since Midway was heading straight toward him. He grabbed the radio microphone, coded transmission to USS Barracuda, his Wolfpack partner, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Robert Kane. Kane was 10 miles south, also on patrol. Kane Harrison transmitted in code, we just hit the jackpot. Count at least 5 battleship-sized contacts. Maybe more. They're heading east at 18 knots. Request you confirm. There was a 15-second pause. Then Kane's voice came back tight with excitement. Confirmed. I have them too. What's the play? And this is where David Harrison made the decision that would kill 360 Japanese sailors in the next 6 hours. He could have reported the fleet and let the aircraft carriers handle it. That would have been the safe play. The smart play. Radio the contact report to fleet headquarters. Let the carriers scramble their dive bombers and torpedo planes at first light. Stand back and let the aviators do their job. But Harrison had been a submarine commander long enough to know one thing. Tomorrow those carriers might not find this fleet. Tomorrow weather could roll in. Tomorrow the Japanese could scatter, change course, disappear into the vastness of the Pacific. Tonight he had them right where he wanted them. Concentrated, predictable, sailing in formation through a narrow passage. Tonight he could do what submarines were built to do. Harrison made his choice. We shadow them until dawn, he transmitted to Kane. Then we attack. Confirm you copy. Copy that, Kane responded. We'll take the left column, you take the right. See you on the other side, see you on the other side. Harrison replaced the microphone. Turned to his crew. Every man in the control room was watching him, waiting for orders. Gentlemen, Harrison said quietly, we're going hunting. For the next 5 hours, we follow that fleet. Silent running, no noise, no mistakes. At dawn, we attack. Questions, there were no questions, just slow nods. These men had trained for this moment, had drilled for it 1,000 times. Shadow the enemy, wait for the perfect shot. Strike hard, disappear. All ahead slow, Harrison ordered. Periscope depth, stay on their starboard quarter range, 10,000 yards. And somebody wake up Chen. I want all 6 bow tubes loaded and ready before sunrise. For the next 5 hours from 12:16 a.m. to 5:15 a.m. USS Swordfish and USS Barracuda played the most dangerous game in naval warfare, the shadow game. Stay close enough to track the target. Stay far enough not to be detected. Listen to their propellers. Watch their silhouettes against the stars. Count their ships. Identify their formation. Plan the attack. Inside Swordfish, the temperature climbed to 105 degrees. The air conditioning couldn't keep up. Men stripped to their waists, sweat pouring off them in rivers. The air was thick and hot and smelled of diesel fuel and unwashed bodies and fear. Harrison stood at the periscope, taking turns with his executive officer, watching the dark shapes of the Japanese fleet move through the water like sleeping whales. Massive shapes, powerful shapes, ships that could blow Swordfish out of the waters with a single salvo if they knew she was there. How many do you count? His executive officer whispered. Harrison counted slowly, carefully. The big ones in the middle, those have to be battleships. Maybe even Yamato or Musashi. I count at least 23 surface contacts total. The executive officer let out a low whistle. Yamato and Musashi were legends, the largest battleships ever built. 72,000 tons each. Guns that could fire a shell the weight of a small car 25 miles. If we can confirm it's Yamato, the XO said, this could be the biggest kill of the war. But Harrison wasn't thinking about glory. He was thinking about those 300 Allied prisoners, the 300 names in his journal, the 300 men he'd killed by mistake. We're not hunting for glory, Harrison said quietly. We're hunting because if we don't stop this fleet, they'll kill thousands of our boys on those landing beaches at Leyte. This time we get it right. This time no mistakes. But there was a problem Harrison didn't know about yet. A problem that would almost ruin everything. At 4:30 a.m., with dawn still an hour away, Swordfish's sonar operator picked up a strange sound. A faint rhythmic pinging, active sonar. Someone was searching. Captain, the sonar man said, his voice tight with tension, I'm picking up active sonar. Could be one of theirs. Could be another submarine. Harrison's blood ran cold. If there was another submarine in the area, a Japanese submarine, and if it detected swordfish, the entire fleet would scatter. Destroyers would come hunting. The element of surprise would be gone. The mission would fail. All stop, Harrison ordered. Silent running. Shut down everything non-essential. Not a sound. The order passed through the boat in whispers. Engines stopped. Ventilation fans stopped. Men froze in place, barely breathing. For 22 minutes, swordfish drifted in the darkness, suspended between the surface and the crushing depths, waiting to see if death would find them. The sonar ping came again. Closer this time, then again, then silence. At 4:52 a.m., the sound faded away. Whatever it was, a whale, a Japanese submarine, an echo off an underwater ridge, it was gone. Harrison let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Ahead slow, he ordered. Resume approach. We're back in business. While two American submarines silently stalked the Japanese fleet through the darkness, deep in the bowels of IJN Akatsuki, Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka was on night watch in engine room number 1, 24 years old, from Kyoto, the son and grandson and great-grandson of shipbuilders. Building ships was in the Tanaka family blood going back 5 generations. His great-great-grandfather had helped build wooden warships for the Shogun. His grandfather had worked on the first steel battleships of the Meiji era. Hiroshi hadn't wanted to join the Navy. He'd wanted to design ships, not sail on them. Wanted to stand in a drafting room with pencils and paper creating the graceful lines that made steel float. But when the war came, the Navy needed engineers more than it needed designers. So Hiroshi Tanaka put on a uniform and went to sea. He was good at his job. Maybe the best engineering officer on Akatsuki. He could diagnose a failing turbine by sound alone, hear the slight change in pitch that meant a bearing was starting to wear. Could fix a steam leak while the engine was still running, his hands moving with the confidence of long practice. Could squeeze an extra 2 knots of speed out of engines that should have been in dry dock for overhaul. On the night of October 23rd, Tanaka was doing his rounds in engine room number 1, walking between the massive turbines, checking temperature gauges, listening to the rhythm of the machinery, making sure everything was running smooth. Everything was running smooth. The engines hummed their steady song. The temperature was normal. The pressure was good. He had 33 hours to live. At 1:30 a.m., Tanaka sat down at his small desk in the corner of the engine room. The heat was incredible, 115 degrees Fahrenheit even at night. His uniform was soaked through with sweat within minutes. He pulled out a piece of paper. Fountain pen, started writing. My dearest Yumi, if you are reading this, it means I did not survive the coming battle. I want you to know that my last thoughts were of you, of our plans to marry in December, of the life we dreamed of building together in Kyoto in my father's house by the river. I want you to know that I am not afraid of dying. What I fear is dying without telling you one more time I love you. I have loved you since we were children, playing by that same river. I will love you until the stars go dark. If I do not return, please do not wait for me. Find a good man, have children. Be happy. Let yourself be happy. That is all I want for you. Always yours, Hiroshi. He folded the letter carefully. Put it in the waterproof pouch he kept in his uniform pocket, right next to his heart, next to the photograph of Yumi smiling in her summer kimono. He would never get a chance to mail it. At 5 o'clock in the morning, Captain Kenji Nakamura, the commanding officer of IJN Akatsuki, stood on the bridge next to Admiral Yamada. Nakamura was 48 years old. He'd been commanding warships for 12 years. Destroyers first, then cruisers. And in those 12 years, he'd developed what sailors call a sixth sense, the ability to feel when something isn't right, even when you can't explain why. A tingling at the base of your skull, a tightness in your chest, an instinct. On the morning of October 24th, Captain Nakamura felt it. Admiral, he said quietly, I recommend we increase speed to 24 knots and change course by 20 degrees. Yamada looked at him. The Admiral's face was tired. He'd aged 10 years in 3 days. Why? Nakamura hesitated. Because I'm not sure, sir. Something feels wrong. We've been in these waters for 6 hours with no air cover. No advanced scouts. We're in the most dangerous part of our route, and we're moving like we're on a training cruise. Yamada considered this. He trusted Nakamura's instincts. The man had been right before, had saved ships with his sixth sense, his ability to smell danger before it arrived. But changing course and speed now would disrupt the entire fleet formation, would burn extra fuel they couldn't spare, would require radio transmissions to coordinate the other ships. And it might all be for nothing. Just nerves before a big battle. Yamada made his decision. Maintain current course and speed, he said. We can't afford to waste fuel on intuition. But put extra lookouts on watch. If there's anything out there, I want to know about it. Yes, sir, Nakamura said. But as he walked away, Nakamura whispered to his executive officer, wake the off-duty watch. I want every lookout at their post. Double the normal watch. If there's a periscope out there, if there's anything, I want eyes on it. It was a good order, a smart order, the kind of order that might have saved the ship. But it came 30 minutes too late. At 5:15 a.m., Commander Harrison gave the order that would start the countdown. Take us in. Attack position. USS Swordfish began moving forward, cutting across the front of the Japanese fleet. It was the most dangerous submarine maneuver in naval warfare. The down-the-throat shot. You position yourself directly in the path of the enemy, let them come towards you, then fire at point-blank range. Do it right and you can't miss. Do it wrong and you get run over by 13,000 tons of steel. The plan was simple. Let the Japanese flagship come to him. Wait until it was 1,000 yards away, then fire all 6 torpedoes. At that range, it would be almost impossible to miss. The problem was that at that range, there would be no time to dive deep enough to escape. Sir, the executive officer said quietly, after we fire, we'll have maybe 90 seconds before their destroyers are on top of us. I know, Harrison said. That's why we're going to fire blow ballast and run. They'll either get us or they won't. In the weapons room, Petty Officer Michael Chen was making final checks on all 6 Mark 14 torpedoes. 22 years old, born in San Francisco, son of Chinese immigrants who ran a laundry on Grant Avenue. Chen had joined the Navy to prove he was American, to prove he belonged. Because even in uniform, even serving his country, some men looked at his face and saw the enemy. But Chen was the best torpedo man on Swordfish. He could strip and reassemble a Mark 14 blindfolded, could adjust the depth settings within a quarter degree, could set the gyros to hit a target 1,000 yards away, moving at 20 knots. If these torpedoes failed to run true, it would be his fault. And he knew it. Tubes 1 through 6 ready, Sir Chen reported. His voice was steady. His hands were not. 5:20 a.m. Distance to target 1,500 yards. Harrison pressed his eye to the periscope. Through the lens, he could see the massive silhouette of a Japanese heavy cruiser. The rising sun behind it made the ship look like a shadow against fire. Beautiful and terrible. Come to Papa, Harrison whispered, 5:25 a.m. Distance 1,200 yards. On Akatsuki's bridge, a lookout suddenly shouted. Periscope port side 045 degrees. Captain Nakamura grabbed his binoculars, searched the water where the lookout was pointing. He saw nothing at first. Just waves, just darkness. Then for just a second he saw it. A thin line cutting through the water. A wake. Then it was gone. Are you certain? Nakamura demanded. I think so, sir. I saw something, but it's gone now. Nakamura's blood ran cold. This was what he'd been afraid of. But was it real? Or was it just nerves? Just a tired lookout, seeing shadows. Sound general quarters, Nakamura ordered. All hands to battle stations. The alarm bells began ringing throughout Akatsuki. Harsh, urgent cutting through the pre-dawn quiet. Men jolted awake, grabbed their helmets, ran to their posts. In engine room number 1, Hiroshi Tanaka heard the bells. He checked his instruments. Everything normal. Everything fine. But his hands were shaking. 5:28 a.m. distance, 1,000 yards. Harrison watched the Japanese cruiser through his periscope. He could see men running on the deck. Could see the gun turrets starting to train outward, searching for targets. They know we're here, the executive officer said. Doesn't matter, Harrison replied. We're too close. They can't maneuver in time. Stand by on all tubes. 5:30 a.m., distance 980 yards. Perfect range. Perfect angle. The cruiser was coming straight at him, bow on, presenting the smallest possible target, but also the most vulnerable. A torpedo hit at the bow would travel the length of the ship, do maximum damage. Harrison took one last look through the periscope. He could see the name painted on the ship's bow in white letters. Akatsuki. The word meant dawn in Japanese. How appropriate, Harrison thought. Dawn is coming. And so is death. He thought about those 300 Allied prisoners, thought about the thousands of American Marines about to land at Leyte, thought about his duty, thought about the price of war. Fire when ready, he said quietly. 5:31 a.m., 60 seconds until hell. On Akatsuki's bridge, Admiral Yamada looked at the photograph of his wife and children one last time. The sun was just breaking over the horizon, turning the sky from black to deep blue to pale gold. It was going to be a beautiful day. He put the photograph back in his pocket. That's when the lookout screamed, "Submarine, submarine, torpedoes in the water." That's when Captain Nakamura grabbed the engine telegraph and rang it to full ahead emergency, knowing it was already too late. That's when the torpedoes were already running 6 white wakes, cutting through the dark water, racing toward their target at 46 knots. And that's when time seemed to slow down the way it does in moments of absolute crisis, when you can see death coming and know there's nothing you can do to stop it. Admiral Yamada stood frozen at the bridge window, watching 6 fingers of death reach out of the sea toward him. He had time for one thought. "Akiko, I'm sorry." Then the first torpedo hit. 5:32 in the morning, 0 seconds. The first torpedo struck Akatsuki's starboard side directly below engine room number 1, where Hiroshi Tanaka stood checking a pressure gauge. The explosion was beyond sound, beyond description. It was a physical force that traveled through steel and water and air, a shockwave that turned the world inside out. A column of white water erupted 60 feet into the air, catching the first light of dawn, turning it into a pillar of fire and spray. The blast tore a hole in the hull 8 meters wide. 8 meters, wide enough to drive 2 trucks through side by side. The ship shuddered. Every rivet screamed, every weld groaned. 13,400 tons of steel and machinery, and men lurched sideways, thrown off balance by the hammer blow beneath the waterline. On the bridge, Admiral Yamada was thrown against the chart table. His shoulder hit the corner with a crack. The photograph of his family fell from his pocket, skittered across the tilting deck. He watched it slide away, watched Akiko's face disappear under someone's boot, and knew he would never hold that photograph again. 3 seconds later, the second torpedo hit. Engine room number 2. Another massive explosion, another column of water, another hole punched through the ship's vitals. 3 seconds after that, the third torpedo. Center of the ship, below the main deck. The blast wave traveled upward through 5 decks, blowing hatches off their hinges, sending men flying like ragdolls. 3 more seconds. The fourth torpedo, aft section, near the propeller shafts. The explosion bent the starboard shaft through the propeller out of alignment. The vibration was immediate and catastrophic, a shuddering that threatened to tear the remaining hull apart. 4 hits out of 6 torpedoes. 12 seconds. 12 seconds to destroy a warship that had taken 3 years to build and 14 years to serve. In engine room number 1, Hiroshi Tanaka was knocked backward by the first blast. His ears rang, his vision blurred. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion and too fast at the same time. Then he saw it coming. The wall of water. It came through the hole in the hull like something alive, like a fist made of ocean with the weight of the Pacific behind it. Water at this depth, even 15 feet below the waterline, carried enormous pressure. It didn't pour in, it exploded in. The temperature was near freezing. The pressure was like standing under 1,000 fire hoses all at once. The force of it swept 3 men off their feet before anyone could move, before anyone could think, before anyone could scream. Tanaka tried to run, tried to reach the watertight door 30 feet away, but the water hit him like a freight train, swept his legs out from under him, slammed him against the massive turbine housing. The turbine was still running, still hot. The metal burned through his uniform, seared his back. He pushed away, gasped for air, got a mouthful of seawater instead. Close the door. Someone was screaming. Close the door, close the door. But the door was already jamming. The force of the explosion had bent the frame, twisted the metal. The door that was supposed to seal the engine room trap, the water save the rest of the ship, wouldn't close. And the water kept coming, kept rising, knee-deep, waist-deep, chest-deep. The lights went out. Total darkness, absolute and complete. The kind of darkness that exists only in sealed compartments deep inside a ship, where no light has ever penetrated, where the sun is just a memory. Tanaka heard men screaming in the darkness, heard the terrible sound of water still pouring in a roar like standing behind a waterfall, heard the groaning of the ship's hull as it began to buckle under the strain. Somebody grabbed his arm in the darkness, squeezed hard. Tanaka. The voice was familiar. It was Sato, his friend, the man who'd shared his watch for 2 years. Help me, I can't swim. The water was at Tanaka's neck now. In 10 more seconds, maybe 15, it would be over his head. In 30 seconds, the compartment would be completely flooded. He had to choose. Try to save Sato, and they both die. Or climb alone, and maybe just maybe survive. For one terrible second, Tanaka considered the easy choice. The safe choice. Save himself. Sato couldn't swim. Sato was already dead. Why die for a dead man? Then he thought about Yumi, about the letter in his pocket, about dying with honor or dying with shame. I've got you, Tanaka shouted into the darkness. Follow my voice. There's a ventilation shaft on the port side. We can climb out. They moved through the darkness by touch and memory. Tanaka knew this engine room better than he knew his own home. Knew every pipe, every valve, every ladder. His hands found the ventilation shaft opening. 24 inches wide, angled upward at 45 degrees toward the main deck. Climb, Tanaka shouted. I'm right behind you. He pushed Sato toward the opening, felt his friend's hands grip the edge, felt him start to climb, pulling himself up into the narrow shaft. Tanaka followed, hand over hand, pulling himself up in pitch darkness. The metal was wet, slippery with condensation and seawater. His hands kept sliding. His shoulders screamed with the effort. Behind him, below him, the water kept rising. He could hear it, could feel it chasing him up the shaft, cold fingers reaching for his feet. Almost there, Tanaka shouted to Sato, Don't stop, don't look down, keep climbing. And then he heard it, the sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life, the sound of Sato's hands slipping on wet metal, the sound of his friend's fingers scrabbling for purchase, finding nothing, the sound of Sato falling backward, down the shaft, down toward the water below. Tanaka. The scream echoed up the shaft. Tanaka, help me. Tanaka reached down in the darkness, felt Sato's hand brush his, grabbed for it, missed, grabbed again, caught Sato's wrist, held on. But Sato was heavy, 160 pounds of dead weight hanging from Tanaka's arm. And Tanaka was braced in a narrow shaft, feet against one side, back against the other, only one hand free to hold his friend. Pull me up. Sato was crying now, please don't let me go. Tanaka pulled, felt his muscles tear, felt something in his shoulder pop. But Sato came up 6 inches, then another 6 inches. Then Tanaka's feet slipped. Just a little, just an inch. But it was enough. The angle changed, the leverage changed. And suddenly holding Sato wasn't just hard, it was impossible. I can't, Tanaka gasped. Sato, I can't hold you. Don't let go. Sato screamed, please don't let go. Below them, the water had reached the bottom of the shaft. In seconds, it would be up to where Sato was hanging, would pull him down, would drown him in darkness. Tanaka felt his grip slipping, felt Sato's wrist sliding through his sweaty hand, felt the moment approaching when he would have to make a choice, save himself, or die with his friend. I'm sorry, Tanaka whispered. I'm so sorry. And he let go. Sato fell. The scream lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then the splash. Then silence. Tanaka kept climbing. Tears streaming down his face. Muscles on fire. Lungs burning. Climbing toward life while his friend drowned in darkness below him. 63 men were trapped below decks when the torpedoes hit. 63 men in the engine rooms, in the ammunition storage, in the low compartments, where the water rushed in first and fastest. 12 would make it out. 51 would die in the darkness, drowning, screaming for help that would never come. Screaming for friends who kept climbing. Screaming until their lungs filled with water, and their screams turned to bubbles and then to nothing at all. On Akatsuki's bridge, 3 decks above the flooding compartments, Admiral Yamada was watching his flagship die. 5:35 a.m., 3 minutes after the torpedoes hit, 3 minutes that felt like 3 hours. The list to starboard was already 18 degrees. Everything on the bridge that wasn't bolted down was sliding to the right. Charts, binoculars, coffee cups. Men had to hold onto railings just to stay upright. Captain Nakamura grabbed Yamada's arm. His face was gray. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had already accepted death. Admiral, you must abandon ship. The ship cannot be saved. Yamada looked at Nakamura, looked past him through the bridge windows at the fleet. Other ships were scattering, changing course, trying to evade more torpedoes. Destroyers were charging around like angry wasps, dropping depth charges, hunting for the submarines. And to the east, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Another column of water shooting into the air. Another explosion. Another ship hit. The fleet, Yamada asked, though he already knew the answer. Suzuki has been hit, Nakamura said quietly. Multiple torpedoes. She's breaking up, sir. And Takao is damaged but still afloat. The rest are scattering. Yamada's mind went numb. In less than 5 minutes, he had lost 2 heavy cruisers, possibly 3, 20% of his cruiser strength, 700 men, maybe more. The center force was crippled before it had even reached the battle. And he was still 24 hours from Leyte Gulf, Admiral Nakamura said again, more urgently this time. You need to transfer to one of the destroyers. The mission continues. The fleet needs you. And you, Nakamura smiled. It was a sad smile. The smile of a man at peace with his fate. I stay with my ship, sir. That is my duty. Your duty is to lead the fleet. Please, sir, go now while there's still time. Yamada looked at the younger man. Nakamura was 48 years old, had a wife in Yokosuka, 2 daughters. One of them was getting married next spring. Nakamura had shown him the wedding invitation 2 weeks ago, proud as any father. Captain Yamada started to say, That's an order, Sir Nakamura said quietly. With all respect, you will abandon this ship and continue the mission. That is what Bushido demands. Not that we die together, but that you live to lead. They looked at each other for a long moment. All the words that needed to be said couldn't be said. There was no time. There was never enough time. It has been an honor, Yamada said. The honor was mine, Admiral. They bowed to each other. A formal bow. The kind you give to someone you will never see again. Then Yamada turned and walked toward the bridge wing, where a rope ladder had been lowered down to the sea. Behind him, Captain Kenji Nakamura stood alone on the bridge of his dying ship and watched the sun rise over the Philippine Sea. 5:40 a.m., 8 minutes after the torpedoes hit. The list had reached 25 degrees. Akatsuki was no longer a ship. She was a dying thing rolling onto her side, spilling her crew into the oil-slicked water. All hands abandoned ship. All hands abandoned ship. The order echoed through the ship on the few communication circuits that still worked. But for many men, the order came too late, or couldn't be obeyed. The lifeboats on the starboard side were underwater, crushed by the ship's roll. The lifeboats on the port side were hanging useless 30 feet above the water, impossible to reach, impossible to lower. Men were jumping, dozens of them, hundreds, leaping from the tilting deck into water covered with fuel oil from ruptured tanks. The oil was thick, black, viscous. It got in your eyes, your mouth, your lungs when you gasped for air. And then inevitably the oil caught fire. No one knew what caused the spark. Maybe damaged electrical cables shorting out. Maybe a cigarette dropped by a panicked sailor. Maybe just metal grinding on metal, creating friction, creating heat, creating that one spark that was all it took. Suddenly the sea was burning. Flames spread across the surface of the water, like a living thing racing along the oil slick, turning the ocean into hell. Men who had just jumped in were surrounded by fire, screaming, swimming frantically, trying to escape flames that moved as fast as they could swim. Some made it. Dove underwater held their breath, swam beneath the flames until their lungs were bursting, surfaced in clear water on the other side. Some didn't make it. The fire caught them. Human hair burns fast. Uniforms soaked in oil burn even faster. Their screams lasted 10 seconds, maybe 15. Then they slipped beneath the surface, too burned to swim, too wounded to live. Admiral Yamada stood at the bridge wing looking down at the rope ladder. 55 years old. Too old to be doing this. Too old for war. Too old to be climbing down a swaying rope ladder on a sinking ship. But there was no choice. Admiral, his aide was shouting, "You must go now. The ship could capsize at any moment." The ladder swayed in the wind, 15 meters down to the water. 15 meters with nothing but rope to hold on to. Yamada grabbed the first rung. His hands were shaking. When had his hands started shaking? He began to climb down, hand over hand. Don't look down. Don't think about the fall. Don't think about the burning water below. Just climb. Halfway down, his hand slipped. For one terrible second, he was falling. Arms windmilling, heart stopping, death rushing up to meet him. Then his training kicked in. His hands found the rope again. Caught it. Held on. His shoulders screamed with the impact. But he was still alive. Still climbing. Keep going. Someone below was shouting, "Don't stop, you're almost there." Yamada reached the bottom of the ladder. The water was right there 3 feet below. He could see the oil, could see the reflection of flames, could smell smoke and fuel and death. He let go and dropped. The water was shockingly cold and covered in oil, thick black oil that got in his mouth, his eyes, his nose. He surfaced, coughing, choking, spitting. The oil burned his throat, made him want to vomit. But if he vomited, he'd breathe in water and oil and he'd drown. So he swam, away from the ship, away from the flames, swimming in oil that made every stroke twice as hard, swimming with his uniform weighing him down, swimming while all around him other men were doing the same. Some swimming, some drowning, some just floating too exhausted to move, waiting for death or rescue, whichever came first. 50 yards away, the sea was on fire. Yamada could feel the heat on his face, could hear the roar of the flames, could hear the screams of men burning. He kept swimming. That's all he could do. Swim and survive, and try not to think about the fact that his flagship was sinking behind him and taking 360 men with it. At 5:45 a.m., 13 minutes after the torpedo attack, Hiroshi Tanaka finally reached the top of the ventilation shaft. His hands were bleeding, raw and torn from climbing on wet metal. His shoulders were on fire. Every muscle in his body screamed, but he was alive. He pulled himself out onto the main deck, or what was left of it. The ship was tilted at 35 degrees now. The deck was like a steep hillside. Everything not bolted down had already slid into the sea. Bodies lay everywhere, some moving, some not. Some sitting with their backs against bulkheads, holding wounds, staring at nothing. Tanaka saw a young sailor, couldn't have been more than 18, sitting against a gun mount. His hands were pressed against his stomach. Blood leaked between his fingers. Dark blood. Too much blood. "Help me," the kid whispered. "Please help me." Tanaka wanted to help. God, he wanted to help. But the ship was listing further every second. Any moment now it would capsize. If he stayed, he would die. If he stopped to help this boy, they would both die. "I'm sorry," Tanaka said. His voice broke. "I'm sorry." He turned away, ran toward the edge of the deck, toward the water, away from the dying boy who kept whispering, "Please, please, please." Tanaka jumped. The fall seemed to take forever. 30 feet through the air. Time enough to think about Sato drowning in the dark. Time enough to think about the boy with blood on his hands. Time enough to wonder if surviving was worth the guilt. Then he hit the water. The impact drove the air from his lungs. He sank deeper than he expected. The water was dark. Which way was up, he couldn't tell. Panic started to rise. His lungs burned. He needed air. Needed it now. Then he saw light above him, pale and green and beautiful. He swam toward it, kicked hard, broke the surface gasping, oil in his mouth, burning his throat. He wanted to vomit, but forced it down. If he vomited, he'd breathe in oil and water, and he'd drown just like Sato, just like all the others trapped below. So he swam through oil, swam away from the burning water, swam toward nothing, toward anywhere that wasn't here, toward life. Tanaka surfaced, gasping, coughing, alive. He had survived. Against all odds, against all logic, he had climbed out of that flooding engine room while his friend drowned below. He was alive. And he would carry that choice for the rest of his life. 5:50 a.m., 18 minutes after the torpedoes hit. Akatsuki was listing 45 degrees. Half the ship was underwater. The other half stood at a crazy angle, gun turrets pointing at the sky, propellers exposed to the air. On the bridge, Captain Kenji Nakamura stood alone. He had ordered his remaining bridge crew to abandon ship. They had refused at first. A captain doesn't abandon his men. Men don't abandon their captain. But Nakamura had made it a direct order, had practically pushed them toward the ladder. They had obeyed reluctantly, looking back as they climbed down. Now it was just Nakamura and his ship. He walked to the bridge wing, looked out at the fleet. The other ships were miles away now, scattered across the ocean, running from the unseen threat beneath the waves. He could see the destroyer Yukikaze turning back, heading toward the survivors in the water. Good. Good men deserve to be rescued. He could see another ship burning on the horizon. Suzuki probably, or what was left of her. And beyond that, the first rays of sunrise turning the clouds pink and gold. It's beautiful, Nakamura thought. I'd forgotten how beautiful dawn could be. He took out the photograph he kept in his breast pocket. His wife, Emiko, his daughters, Hanako and Yuki, taken last spring in their garden in Yokosuka, cherry blossoms in bloom. Everyone smiling, a perfect moment frozen in time. Nakamura looked at their faces, memorized them one last time. Then he carefully put the photograph back in his pocket, buttoned the pocket closed. He would take them with him to the bottom. 5:54 a.m. The list reached 60 degrees. The massive gun turrets, each one weighing hundreds of tons, began to shift. They were bolted to the deck with steel bolts as thick as a man's arm. But nothing could withstand this kind of stress. The bolts began to snap. Pop, 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 like gunshots. The forward turret broke free. 2,000 tons of steel and machinery crashed through the deck, plunged into the sea, with a splash that sent waves rolling across the water. The ship groaned, a sound like a living thing in pain. Metal tearing, rivets popping, bulkheads collapsing. The ship was breaking apart from the inside. 5:57 a.m. List at 70 degrees. 700 meters away, Admiral Yamada had been pulled onto a life raft by sailors from the destroyer Yukikaze. The destroyer itself was standing off, afraid to come closer, afraid of the submarines that might still be lurking below. Yamada stood on the small raft, dripping oil and seawater, shivering, despite the tropical heat, watching his flagship's final moments. "Come on," he whispered. "Sink already. Don't make them suffer any longer. Please. Just sink." As if the ship had heard his prayer, Akatsuki suddenly rolled completely over. 5:58 a.m. The ship was upside down, bottom facing the sky. The red anti-fouling paint on the hull looked like blood in the dawn light. For a moment, just a moment, the ship floated there, suspended between life and death, between the surface and the depths. Captain Nakamura stood on the upside-down bridge, holding on to a railing that now pointed downward instead of up. The water was creeping closer, would reach him in seconds. He didn't run, didn't try to swim, didn't jump. He just stood there at attention as the water rose around his feet, his knees, his waist. A captain doesn't abandon his ship, Nakamura thought. Not ever, not even at the end, especially at the end. The water reached his chest, his neck, his chin. He took one last breath, looked at the sunrise one last time. Then the water closed over his head, and Captain Kenji Nakamura went down with his ship. 5:59 a.m. The bow dipped, the stern rose, and then smoothly, almost gently, as if the ship were just tired and wanted to rest, IJN Akatsuki slid beneath the waves. The suction pulled everything down with it. Debris, life rafts, men who were swimming too close. The water churned and boiled as air escaped from the sinking hull, thousands of cubic meters of air rising in massive bubbles that burst on the surface. For 30 seconds, the ocean was whirlpools, waves, bubbles, screaming. Then suddenly it was over. 6 o'clock a.m. exactly. From first torpedo hit to final sinking, 28 minutes. Akatsuki fell through the darkness, down past the sunlight zone, down past where any diver could follow, down through water so cold it would freeze a man in minutes, down through crushing pressure that would collapse a man's lungs like paper bags, down 4,200 meters to the bottom of Palawan Passage. The hull hit the ocean floor with a thud that sent up clouds of sediment. The impact buried the bow 10 feet into the mud. The stern settled more gently, coming to rest at a slight angle. And there it would lie, for 71 years, a tomb for 360 men, a monument to 28 minutes that changed everything. On the surface, the sea was a nightmare. Oil fires still burned in patches. Bodies floated among the debris. Wreckage covered a square mile of ocean. Life rafts bobbed in the swell, packed with survivors surrounded by men still in the water. The destroyer Yukikaze moved slowly through the debris field, picking up survivors one by one, throwing lines, lowering nets, pulling men from the water. Admiral Yamada was brought aboard Yukikaze at 6:15 a.m. He collapsed on the deck, coughing up oil and seawater. Someone wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. Someone else pressed a cup of water into his hands. He drank without tasting it. Around him, other survivors were being pulled aboard. Some were wounded. Some were burned. Neither of them were covered in oil, black from head to toe, looking like they'd crawled out of hell itself, which in a way they had. Yamada watched the rescue operation in silence, counted each man saved, each body recovered. The arithmetic of disaster. A young ensign approached, his uniform still dry, his face pale with shock. "Admiral," he said quietly, "we've recovered 320 men from Akatsuki so far. Still searching for more. And we've picked up 150 from Suzuki. Takao is still afloat but heavily damaged. She's turning back to Brunei." Yamada did the math automatically. 700 men on Akatsuki, 320 recovered. That meant 380 dead or missing, close to the final count of 360 confirmed killed. Suzuki's crew was 936, 150 recovered, over 700 dead, nearly 1,000 men lost in 15 minutes. 20% of his cruiser strength gone before he'd even reached the battle. The ensign was still standing there waiting for orders. His face said he already knew what the answer would be. But he had to ask, "Admiral, what are your orders? Do we continue to Leyte Gulf or do we withdraw?" And this was the question that would define the rest of Takeshi Yamada's life. The smart decision was obvious. Withdraw. They'd been ambushed, lost a quarter of their strength. The Americans knew they were coming. The element of surprise was gone. Continuing would be suicide, but nearly 1,000 men had just died. If he turned back now, they died for nothing. All those men drowning in darkness, all those screams, all that sacrifice, for nothing. And the mission, the Emperor's orders, break through to Leyte Gulf, destroy the American landing forces, turn the tide of the war. Could he abandon that mission because of one setback? Even a catastrophic one. Yamada looked at the eastern horizon. The sun was fully up now, burning away the morning mist. Somewhere beyond that horizon, American forces were landing at Leyte, thousands of them, tens of thousands, and it was his job to stop them. He thought about Captain Nakamura standing on the bridge as the water rose around him, about Hiroshi Tanaka choosing to live while his friend drowned, about 360 men who would never see another sunrise. What would they want him to do? Give up? Go home? Let their deaths mean nothing or finish the mission? "We continue," Yamada said quietly. The ensign's eyes widened. "Sir, are you certain we continue?" Yamada repeated louder this time. "Reform the fleet. Proceed to Leyte Gulf as planned. That is an order." "Yes, sir." The ensign saluted and hurried away to relay the orders. Around Yamada, staff officers exchanged glances. Some nodded in approval, some looked doubtful. None spoke. And so the shattered fleet reformed. The surviving ships gathered together, counted their strength, adjusted their formation. The destroyers took up screening positions. The battleships moved to the center. The remaining cruisers fell into line. At 10:22 a.m., 4 hours after Akatsuki sank, Admiral Yamada climbed aboard the battleship Yamato to resume command. The super battleship, largest in the world, 72,000 tons of steel and guns and pride. From Yamato's towering bridge, Yamada looked back at the sea where Akatsuki had gone down. The oil fires had burned out. The debris was scattered. The survivors were all aboard the rescue ships. The water was calm now, as if nothing had happened, as if nearly 1,000 men hadn't died screaming. But Yamada knew, he would always know, would carry the memory of this morning for the rest of his life. The sound of the explosions, the sight of his ship rolling over, the faces of men drowning. He gave the order. All ships ahead standard. Course 090. Destination Leyte Gulf. And the fleet moved east toward the battle that waited for them, toward the destiny that had been written the moment those 6 torpedoes had left their tubes. But that's tomorrow's story. That's the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where Japan's mighty battleships would be turned back by America's destroyers. That's the story of how Yamada would make decisions that military historians would debate for the next 80 years. Today's story ends here at 6 a.m. on October 24th, 1944, with 360 men lying dead in the darkness, 4,000 meters below, with survivors covered in oil, being pulled from the sea with a fleet that had lost a quarter of its strength before the real battle even began. Today's story ends with Admiral Takeshi Yamada standing on the bridge of Yamato, looking east toward an uncertain future, carrying the weight of hundreds of deaths on his shoulders. And 400 meters below Yamato, in the darkness beneath the waves, Commander David Harrison sat in the control room of USS Swordfish, listening to the sounds of rescue operations above, knowing he had just killed hundreds of men, wondering if he would ever sleep peacefully again. The war was far from over. But for 360 Japanese sailors, for 336 more on Suzuki, the war had ended at dawn on October 24, 1944, in the dark waters of Palawan Passage. They would never grow old, never see their families again, never know how the war ended, never know that in 71 years their ship would be found and remembered. All they knew was water rising in the darkness, fire burning on the surface, friends screaming, life ending. And in those final moments, what did they think about? Their families probably, their homes, the faces of loved ones, the lives they would never live. Just like any soldier in any war, just like any man facing death far from home. 200 feet below the surface of Palawan Passage, Commander David Harrison stood in the control room of USS Swordfish, listening to death. Through the hull of the submarine, through the water, the sounds carried, muffled but unmistakable. Explosions as depth charges detonated in the distance, the groan of metal as ships broke apart, the rumble of vessels sinking. And if you listened very carefully, if you pressed your ear against the cold steel hull and held your breath, you could hear something else. Screaming, hundreds of men dying in the water above them. And there was nothing Harrison could do, couldn't surface to rescue them. There were Japanese destroyers hunting for swordfish, dropping depth charges, searching with sonar. Couldn't even acknowledge what he was hearing. Had to stay silent, had to stay deep, had to survive. Harrison stood perfectly still, face like carved stone, listening to men drown. His executive officer stood beside him. Neither man spoke. What was there to say? This was war. This was what they'd trained for, what they'd been sent here to do. Sink enemy ships, kill enemy sailors, win the war one torpedo at a time. But knowing something intellectually and living with it emotionally were two very different things. At 6:05 a.m., the sound stopped. Akatsuki had sunk. The screaming had faded. There was only the deep silence of the ocean, now broken occasionally by the ping of Japanese sonar searching, never quite finding. "Course, sir," the helmsman asked quietly. Harrison had to clear his throat twice before he could speak. His mouth was dry. His hands were shaking. He shoved them in his pockets so no one would see. "Take us south," he said, deep and slow. "We've done our job here." The submarine turned away from the battle zone, diving deeper, running silent, escaping into the vast darkness of the Pacific. Behind them, hundreds of men struggled in burning water. Ahead of them lay nothing but ocean and the long journey back to port. Harrison walked slowly to his tiny cabin, closed the door, sat down at his small desk, pulled out his journal, the leather-bound book he'd been keeping since 1942. His hands shook as he picked up his pen. October 24th, 1944, 06:05 hours. Sunk Japanese heavy cruiser, probably Takao class, with 4 torpedo hits out of 6 fired. Estimate 300 to 400 casualties based on size of vessel and time to sink. He stopped writing, stared at the words. 300 to 400 casualties. Such clinical language. Such neat numbers. As if each one wasn't a man with a name, a face, a family waiting at home. He thought about the 300 Allied prisoners he'd killed in 1943. Thought about how he'd written their names in this same journal. Read them every night like a prayer or a penance. Should he do the same now? Write down the names of the Japanese sailors he'd just killed. But he didn't know their names, didn't know anything about them except that they were dead and he had killed them. Harrison continued writing the words, coming slowly, painfully. "I thought killing those 300 Allied prisoners in 43 was the worst thing I'd ever do. But at least that was a mistake. An accident. I didn't mean to kill them. This was deliberate. I aimed those torpedoes. I calculated the firing solution. I gave the order to fire. I killed those men on purpose. They were the enemy. They would have killed Americans if I hadn't stopped them. I know this. I believe this. We saved lives today. Maybe thousands of lives at Leyte Gulf. So why can't I stop hearing them scream? He closed the journal, put his head in his hands, and for the first time since joining the Navy commander, David Harrison, former school teacher from Ohio, sat alone in his cabin and cried. Not for long, maybe 2 minutes. 3 at most. Then he wiped his face, stood up, straightened his uniform, and went back to the control room to command his submarine. Because that's what officers did. They carried their burdens privately and showed strength publicly. They made the hard decisions and lived with the consequences. That question he'd written in his journal, why can't I stop hearing them scream, would haunt David Harrison for the next 46 years. But the answer, the real answer, was simple. Because he was human. And being human meant carrying the weight of the lives you'd taken even when you'd taken them for the right reasons. The war ended 9 months later, August 15, 1945. Japan surrendered. Admiral Yamada survived. He'd made it through the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where the center force had turned back just short of victory. Through the sinking of Musashi, hit by 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs going down with 1,000 men. Through the final desperate battles as Japan crumbled, city by city, defeat by defeat. In September 1945, Yamada returned to Tokyo, or what was left of it. The city was rubble, firebombed, destroyed. Whole neighborhoods burned to ash. The imperial palace still stood, but surrounding it was devastation on a scale that defied comprehension. Yamada's home in the suburbs had burned. His wife Akiko and the children had evacuated to the countryside to her brother's farm in Nagano Prefecture. They had survived on rice and vegetables, on charity and determination, waiting for the war to end, waiting to see if Takeshi would come home. When Yamada walked through the door of his brother-in-law's farmhouse, his daughter Yuki didn't recognize him at first. She was 16 now, almost a woman. Her father had left as a strong, confident naval officer in 1941. He came back in 1945 as a broken old man. Kenji, 14, was the first to speak. "Father, is that really you?" Yamada nodded, couldn't find words. His son had grown half a foot. His voice had changed. He was almost a man now, and Yamada had missed all of it. Missed the birthdays and school ceremonies and all the small moments that make up a childhood. Akiko came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She saw Yamada and stopped. They looked at each other across the room. 4 years apart. 4 years of war and death in letters that said nothing important because the censors read everything. She walked to him, didn't run, just walked slowly, steadily, stopped in front of him, looked up at his face, saw the lines that hadn't been there before, the gray in his hair, the weight in his eyes. "Welcome home," she said quietly. And then Takeshi Yamada did something he hadn't done once during 4 years of war. He broke down. Right there in his brother-in-law's farmhouse, in front of his children, in front of everyone. He put his arms around his wife and sobbed like a child. For Nakamura, for the 360 men on Akatsuki, for Tanaka's friend Sato, for every man who died under his command, for every decision he'd made that sent men to their deaths, for the weight of it all. Akiko held him, didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations, just held him and let him cry. The children stood awkwardly nearby, not knowing what to do, never having seen their father like this. Eventually, Kenji, the boy, who wanted to be brave like his father, asked the question quietly. "Father, did you fight in any big battles?" Yamada pulled away from Akiko, wiped his face, tried to compose himself, looked at his son and saw innocence there still despite 4 years of war, despite the hunger and fear. "Yes," Yamada said. "Meribidos, did you win?" Yamada thought about Akatsuki sinking in 28 minutes, about 360 men drowning in darkness, about the decision to continue to Leyte Gulf with a crippled fleet, about the battle where his massive battleships had been turned back by a handful of American destroyers, about losing the war. "No," Yamada said quietly. "We did not win." That was the last time Yamada spoke about the war in his home. His children learned never to ask. His wife learned never to press. The war became a closed subject, a sealed room in their house that no one entered. But every year on October 24th, the anniversary of Akatsuki's sinking, Akiko would wake at 3 in the morning to find Yamada's side of the bed empty. She'd find him sitting in their small garden in the darkness before dawn, staring at nothing. And sometimes if she listened very closely, she could hear him whispering, Nakamura, Tanaka, Sato, Kobayashi, Watanabe, Yoshida, Kimura, on and on. 360 names, every single man who had died on Akatsuki. Yamada had memorized all of them, learned their names from the casualty lists, spent hours, days, months burning those names into his memory. Because if he didn't remember them, who would Commander David Harrison, mustered out of the Navy in November 1945, returned to Columbus, Ohio, tried to go back to teaching. The school district welcomed him back, gave him his old position teaching algebra and geometry to high school sophomores. It lasted 3 months. The nightmares were too bad. Every night the same dream. Standing on the bridge of Swordfish, looking through the periscope, watching the torpedoes hit, watching the columns of water, watching the ship roll over, and then diving down, swimming through the dark water, seeing the faces of the men trapped inside, seeing them scream silently in their steel tomb. He'd wake up gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, heart hammering. His wife would wake beside him, reach for him, but he'd pull away. Couldn't let her see, couldn't let her know. After 3 months, the school principal called him in, sat him down, spoke kindly but firmly. David, you're a good teacher, always have been, but you're not here, you're somewhere else. The students can tell. Your mind is elsewhere. I know, Harrison said. I'm sorry, don't be sorry. You served your country, did things most of us can't imagine. But maybe teaching isn't the right place for you right now. Maybe you need time. So Harrison resigned, took his Navy pension, small but enough to live on, bought a little house on a lake outside Columbus, spent his days fishing. Alone, his wife left him in 1948. No anger, no drama, just quiet sadness. I love you, David, she said as she packed her bags. But I can't live with a ghost, and that's what you've become, a ghost who looks like my husband. Harrison didn't argue. She was right. He died somewhere in the Pacific in 1944 and just forgotten to stop breathing. For the next 40 years, David Harrison lived alone in his house by the lake, fished, read, worked odd jobs when he needed money, kept his journal. Every October 24th, the same entry. October 24th, 1996. Today, I killed 360 men, again, because that's how it felt. Not like something that happened once in the past, but like something that kept happening over and over every day, every night in his dreams and waking thoughts. The burden never got lighter. He just got stronger at carrying it. In 1960, 15 years after the war ended, something extraordinary happened. There was an international conference in San Francisco for Pacific War veterans, Japanese veterans, American veterans, former enemies meeting face to face for the first time since the surrender. The goal was reconciliation, understanding, healing. Admiral Takeshi Yamada attended. He was 71 years old now, retired from the Navy with full honors, living quietly in a small apartment in Tokyo. His children were grown, married, had children of their own. Yuki was a teacher. Kenji worked for an electronics company. Both were doing well. Both had families. But Yamada was alone. Akiko had died 2 years earlier. Cancer. He'd nursed her through the final months, watching her fade, feeling helpless. And when she died, part of him was relieved, because she'd been the last connection to the man he had been before the war. With her gone, he could finally stop pretending. Commander David Harrison also attended the conference. He was 50 years old, still living alone, still fishing, still writing in his journal. When the invitation came, his first instinct was to throw it away. Why would he want to meet Japanese veterans? What would they talk about? But something made him keep the invitation, made him buy a plane ticket, made him put on his old Navy uniform, tight around the middle now, but still serviceable, and fly to San Francisco. The conference organizers had arranged tables by campaign. Guadalcanal veterans here, Iwo Jima there, Okinawa over there, Philippines campaigns in the back corner. Yamada sat at the latte golf table, sipping tea, talking to other Japanese veterans and quiet Japanese, sharing memories, carefully edited for foreign ears. Harrison walked past, saw the table designation, Lady Golf, saw the Japanese veterans sitting there. Old men now, gray hair, lined faces, some missing limbs, all carrying the same weight Harrison carried. He stopped, froze, because sitting at that table looking up at him with recognition in his eyes was a man Harrison had never met but somehow knew. Their eyes met. Neither spoke for 10 seconds, just looked at each other. Two old warriors, two haunted men, two survivors of a war that had ended 15 years ago but would never really end. Finally, Harrison stepped forward, held out his hand. His voice was rough with emotion. "I'm David Harrison, USS Swordfish." Yamada looked at the hand, looked at Harrison's face, understood immediately. This was the man who had sunk a Katsuki. This was the man who had killed 360 of his sailors. This was the enemy. This was a man carrying the same burden. Yamada stood slowly, bowed slightly, then took Harrison's hand. "Takeshi Yamada." "IJN Akatsuki." They shook hands, an American submarine commander and a Japanese admiral. Killer and victim, enemy and enemy, human and human. "I'm sorry about your ship," Harrison said. His voice was barely a whisper. "About your men. I think about them. Every day, every night. I hear them." Yamada's face didn't change. His grip on Harrison's hand tightened slightly. "You were doing your duty," Yamada said. His English was accented but clear. "I was doing mine. In war, men die. That is the nature of war. It is not your fault. It is not my fault. It is war's fault." Harrison felt something break inside him at those words, something that had been locked tight for 16 years. Tears started down his face and he didn't try to hide them. "But I hear them," he said again. "In my sleep, I hear them drowning. I hear them screaming. And I know their names. I know every name. 360 men." Yamada's eyes widened slightly. "You know their names," Harrison nodded. "I memorized them. From intelligence reports. After the war. I needed to know who they were, who I'd killed. And that's when Takeshi Yamada did something that surprised everyone watching. He smiled. Not a happy smile, a sad smile, a knowing smile. The smile of a man who'd found someone who understood. "So do I," Yamada said quietly. "Every night for 15 years, I say their names. Nakamura, Tanaka, Sato, all 360. I say their names so someone remembers." They stood there in the middle of the conference hall, two old men holding hands, both crying now. While around them, the noise of the conference faded away. "Would you like to have dinner?" Harrison asked. "I'd like to hear about them. Your crew, your ship. I'd like to know who they were. Not just names, who they were." Yamada nodded slowly. "Yeah, I would like that very much." They had dinner that night in a small Japanese restaurant near the conference hotel, talked for 4 hours. Yamada told Harrison about Captain Nakamura, who had stayed with his ship, about Lieutenant Tanaka, the young engineer who'd survived by climbing through a ventilation shaft while his friend drowned below, about Sato, the sailor who couldn't swim, about dozens of others, each with their own story, each with their own life cut short. Harrison told Yamada about the 300 Allied prisoners he'd killed by mistake in 1943, about the guilt that ate at him, about the nights he couldn't sleep, about feeling like he'd died in the war and was just walking around afterward. And slowly over sake and sushi and shared pain, something like healing began. Not forgiveness. They weren't looking for forgiveness. What they'd done didn't need forgiving. They'd been soldiers in a war. They'd followed orders, done their duty, but understanding, recognition, the knowledge that they weren't alone in carrying this weight. At the end of the dinner, as they were leaving, Yamada turned to Harrison one more time. "Thank you," he said, "for remembering them, for carrying their names. I thought I was alone in that burden." "You're not alone," Harrison said, "and neither am I. Not anymore." They shook hands again, exchanged addresses, promised to write, and they did. For the next 30 years until Yamada's death in 1977, they exchanged letters. Not often, maybe twice a year. But each letter was honest in a way that neither man could be with anyone else. Because only another veteran understands what war truly costs. Only another survivor knows what it means to carry the dead. Hiroshi Tanaka, the young engineer who'd climbed out of the flooding engine room, who'd let his friend Sato fall rather than die with him, survived the war. Made it back to Kyoto, found Yumi waiting for him just as she'd promised. They married in December 1945, had 3 children. 6 grandchildren. Tanaka lived to be 94 years old, dying in 2014, 1 year before Akatsuki was discovered on the ocean floor. He never talked about what happened in the engine room, never told his wife about Sato, never told anyone about the choice he'd made, save himself or die with his friend. But his daughter Keiko remembered something. Every year on the same day in October, her father would take a small wooden boat out onto the Kamo River near their home in Kyoto, alone. He'd float there for exactly 28 minutes. Wouldn't fish, wouldn't read, just sit in the boat looking at the water, his lips moving silently. When Keiko asked him once what he was doing, Tanaka looked at her with eyes that were 1,000 miles away. "I'm remembering," he said, "just remembering. Remembering what father a friend. A choice, the price of living." He never explained further, and she never asked again. But after Tanaka died, Keiko found something in his belongings. A letter yellowed with age ink, faded but still readable. Addressed to Yumi, but never sent. Written on October 23rd, 1944, the night before Akatsuki sank. "My dearest Yumi, if you are reading this, it means I did not survive. I want you to know I love you. I have always loved you. I will always love you." And below that, added in different ink, in a shaking hand dated October 25th, 1944, the day after he survived. "I lived, Yumi, but Sato died. I chose to live and let him die. I will carry this choice until my own death, but I will live. For you, for the life we planned, even though part of me died in that engine room with Sato." Keiko read the letter and finally understood why her father spent 28 minutes on the river every October. He was giving Sato the time he'd taken from him. 28 minutes. The time it took Akatsuki to sink. The time it took Sato to drown while Tanaka climbed to safety. It was a debt that could never be repaid. But Tanaka had tried anyway for 70 years, one morning at a time. Admiral Takeshi Yamada died in 1977. He was 88 years old. Died peacefully in his sleep in his small Tokyo apartment, surrounded by photographs of Akiko, of his children, of his grandchildren. His will contained specific instructions: cremate his body, scatter his ashes at sea, specifically at the coordinates where Akatsuki had sunk: 9 degrees 18 minutes north, 117 degrees 19 minutes east. "I want to be with my men," he'd written. "I commanded them in life. I should rest with them in death." His children honored his wishes. Kenji, his son, now 53 years old, chartered a boat, brought his sister Yuki, brought their children, sailed out to the coordinates their father had specified. The ocean was calm that day, clear blue sky, gentle swells, beautiful weather. They stood at the rail of the boat. Kenji held the urn containing his father's ashes. Yuki held a wreath of white flowers. The grandchildren stood quietly, not really understanding, but knowing this was important. Kenji opened the urn, spoke quietly. "Father, you carried these men with you for 33 years. You spoke their names every morning. You remembered when everyone else forgot. Now you can rest with them. Now you can be at peace." He poured the ashes into the water. They drifted down gray and white against the blue, dispersing, spreading, sinking toward the bottom 4,000 meters below, where Akatsuki rested. Yuki threw the wreath into the water. It floated there, white against blue, a marker, a memorial, a promise that they were not forgotten. The family stood in silence for a long time. Then they turned the boat and headed home. Behind them, the wreath slowly drifted away, carried by currents, eventually sinking, eventually dissolving. But for that moment, marking the grave of 361 men who had gone to war and never come home. Commander David Harrison died in 1990 at age 80, heart attack in his sleep, quick and painless. His children, who he hadn't seen in years, came to clean out his house. Found it surprisingly neat, everything in order, as if he'd been preparing for this moment. They found his wartime journals, 48 years of journals, every single day from 1942 to 1990. And in every single journal on October 24th of each year, the same entry. October 24th, 19XX. "Today I killed 360 men, again." His son James read through the journals with tears streaming down his face. He'd never known. His father had never spoken of the war, never explained the nightmares, never shared the burden. Now reading the journals, James understood. His father hadn't been cold or distant or unavailable. His father had been drowning, had been carrying a weight so heavy it had crushed everything else in his life. At the funeral, James did something his father had requested in his will. He read aloud 360 names, Japanese names that he stumbled over, mispronouncing many of them, but reading every single one. The names of the men his father had killed. The names his father had carried for 46 years. Some people at the funeral were confused. Why read the names of enemy soldiers? But the veterans in attendance understood. They stood at attention as the names were read. A tribute, a remembrance, an acknowledgement of the cost of war. After the funeral, James tried to find Yamada's family, wanted to tell them about the letters, about the friendship, about how two enemies had found peace and shared understanding. But Yamada had died 13 years earlier. His children had moved. The trail was cold. So James kept his father's journals, put them in a box, stored them in his attic, forgot about them for years. Until 2015, when something remarkable happened. March 2015. The research vessel Petrel, funded by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, was searching the deep waters of Palawan Passage for World War II shipwrecks. They'd already found several, using modern sonar technology that could map the ocean floor in stunning detail. Side-scan sonar, multi-beam sonar, technology that could see through 4,000 meters of water as clearly as looking through air. On March 15th, they found something. A sonar contact, 4,200 meters down, large, intact, right where the historical record said IJN Akatsuki had sunk. They sent down a remotely operated vehicle, an ROV, equipped with high-definition cameras and lights powerful enough to illuminate the abyssal darkness. For 3 hours, the ROV descended through water that got progressively colder, darker, more hostile to life. At 4,187 meters, the ROV's lights illuminated something that made everyone in the control room gasp. A ship, sitting upright on the ocean floor, remarkably intact despite 71 years underwater. The hull was covered in rust and sediment, but the basic structure was still there. The gun turrets, the superstructure, the deck. The ROV moved slowly along the hull, and there, painted on the bow, still visible after 7 decades, the name in white letters against dark steel. Akatsuki. My God, the expedition leader whispered. We found her. For the next 6 hours, the ROV documented the wreck. Every angle, every detail, the massive holes in the starboard side where the torpedoes had hit, the twisted metal, the collapsed decks, the bridge where Captain Nakamura had stood. And in one pass, the ROV captured something that made the entire team fall silent. The ship's bell, still hanging in its mount near the bridge, still bearing the ship's name engraved in Japanese characters. The expedition leader was a naval historian named Robert Greene, American, had spent 30 years studying the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And as he watched the footage of Akatsuki's bell, a thought occurred to him. 360 men still lived in that ship. Oh, their bodies were long gone, dissolved by time and pressure and the chemistry of the deep ocean. But their spirits, their memory, that was still there, preserved in steel and sediment, waiting to be remembered. Greene made a decision. They would organize a memorial service, invite the families of the men who died, American veterans who'd fought in the battle, create a moment of remembrance and reconciliation. It took a year to organize, but in March 2016, a boat chartered by the expedition sailed out to the coordinates where Akatsuki rested. On board were 60 Japanese families, sons and daughters and grandchildren of men who died when the ship went down. Most had never known their fathers or grandfathers, just names and faded photographs and stories passed down through generations. Also on board were American veterans, old men now, in their 90s, the last survivors of the Pacific War, including Robert Kane, the commander of USS Barracuda, who had sunk the cruiser Suzuki. He was 102 years old, frail but determined to be there. Michael Chen was there too, 92 years old now. The Chinese-American torpedo man from USS Swordfish, who had loaded those 6 torpedoes 72 years ago. He stood quietly at the rail remembering that night, remembering the fear, remembering the moment when he'd reported all tubes ready. And James Harrison, David Harrison's son, carrying his father's journals, carrying the weight his father had carried. The ceremony was simple, no speeches, no politics, just remembrance. The Japanese families stood at the rail. One by one they came forward and threw white roses into the water. 360 roses, one for each man who had died. Each family member spoke a name as they threw their rose. Kenji Nakamura, Sato, Kobayashi, Watanabe, Yoshida, on and on. 360 names. 360 roses floating on the surface of the Pacific, marking the grave 4,000 meters below. When the Japanese families finished, Robert Kane stepped forward, 102 years old, hands shaking, tears streaming down his weathered face. He threw a rose into the water. "For the men I killed," he said quietly, "I was doing my duty. But you were doing yours. Rest in peace." Then Michael Chen stepped forward, the old torpedo man, the Chinese-American who had spent his whole life proving he belonged. "I loaded those torpedoes," Chen said, his voice cracking. "I set the gyros. I made sure they ran true. For 72 years, I told myself I was just doing my job, just following orders. But they were men, just like me, just trying to survive." He threw his rose into the water. Then he saluted, a crisp, perfect salute to the men he'd helped kill. "For doing my duty," Chen whispered, "and for finally understanding what it cost." Then James Harrison stepped forward. He opened his father's journal from 1944, found the entry from October 24th, read it aloud. October 24th, 1944. 06:05 hours. Sunk Japanese heavy cruiser with 4 torpedo hits. Estimate 300 to 400 casualties. I thought killing 300 Allied prisoners was the worst thing I'd ever do. But this was deliberate. I killed these men on purpose. So why can't I stop hearing them scream? James's voice broke. He looked at the Japanese families standing nearby. "My father carried your fathers and grandfathers with him for 46 years, James said. He never forgot them. He said their names every day. He heard them in his dreams. And he died still hearing them. I hope that now finally they can all rest." He threw 360 roses into the water, one by one, counting them out, making sure the number was exact. His father would have wanted that. A Japanese woman stepped forward. She was in her 70s. Her name was Emiko. She was Captain Nakamura's daughter, the baby he'd never met, born 2 months after Akatsuki sank. She walked up to James, bowed deeply. When she straightened, she was crying. "Thank you," she said in English, "for remembering, for carrying them. My father stayed with his ship. He chose duty over life. I never knew him, but knowing that others remembered him, that matters. Thank you." James bowed back. Then impulsively they hugged. Two people who'd never met, whose fathers had been enemies, whose nations had been at war, holding each other and crying for losses, 72 years old but still fresh. And all around them, Japanese families and American veterans did the same, shaking hands, hugging, sharing stories, building bridges across the chasm of war. A young Japanese man, maybe 40 years old, approached Robert Kane, put his hand on the old veteran's shoulder. "My grandfather died on Akatsuki," the man said. "Engine room, I never knew him. But my father told me he was a good man. An engineer, he loved ships." Kane nodded slowly, tears in his eyes. "My father told me something before he died." The young man continued. "He said his father, my grandfather, wrote a letter the night before the attack. Said he wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of dying without telling his fiancée he loved her. That's what war took from him. Not his life, his future." Kane couldn't speak, could only nod. "The war killed them," the young man said gently. "Not you, the war. You did your duty. My grandfather did his. Neither of you wanted to be enemies. But war made you enemies. Don't carry that burden anymore. You've carried it long enough." And Robert Kane, 102 years old, the last surviving submarine commander from the Battle of Leyte Gulf, finally let go of the weight he'd carried for 72 years. The memorial service lasted 2 hours. When it ended, the boat turned and headed back to port. Behind them, 360 white roses drifted on the surface of the Pacific, slowly spreading, eventually sinking, marking the place where Akatsuki rested. 4,200 meters below, in the eternal darkness, the ship lay silent, home to coral now, to deep-sea fish, to the slow, patient processes of the ocean. The men who had died there were long gone, their bones dissolved. Their uniforms rotted away, nothing left but memory and steel. But they were not forgotten, would never be forgotten. Not while people remembered, not while sons and daughters told their children about grandfathers they'd never met. Not while old veterans woke in the night hearing screams from 70 years ago. This is what war costs. Not just the lives lost in battle, but the lives haunted afterward. The survivors who carry the dead. The children who grow up without fathers. The wives who grow old alone. The weight that gets passed down through generations. Admiral Yamada carried 360 names for 33 years. Commander Harrison carried them for 46 years. Their children carried them after that. And now anyone who hears this story carries them too, because that's how memory works. That's how we honor the dead. Not by forgetting, not by moving on, but by remembering, by carrying them with us, by making sure their sacrifice meant something. 360 men died in 28 minutes on October 24, 1944. They died far from home in dark water, afraid and alone, calling for mothers and wives and children they would never see again. But they were not numbers. They were not statistics. They were Nakamura and Tanaka and Sato and Kobayashi and 356 others. Each with a name, each with a story, each with a life that mattered. And 71 years after they died, people gathered above their grave to remember them, to say their names, to honor their sacrifice. That's what separates us from other nations. That's what makes America great. Not our weapons, not our victories, but our capacity to see our enemies as human beings, to mourn their losses as well as our own, to build bridges instead of walls. Admiral Yamada and Commander Harrison were enemies, but they became friends, because they recognized in each other the burden of command, the weight of lives taken, the cost of duty. The war ended in 1945. But for the men who fought it, the war never really ended. It just changed form, became nightmares instead of battles, became guilt instead of fear, became a weight carried in silence for decades. If you're watching this and you served in the military, you know these stories matter. You know the hardest part of war isn't the fighting. It's living with what you had to do. So share this story. Share it with veterans who carry burdens. Share it with children who want to understand what grandfather went through. Share it with anyone who thinks war is glorious or simple or clean. Because war is none of those things. War is Admiral Yamada sitting in his garden at 3 a.m. whispering names. War is Commander Harrison writing in his journal for 46 years. Today, I killed 360 men again. War is Hiroshi Tanaka spending 28 minutes on a river every October remembering the friend he let fall. War is the price we pay in nightmares and guilt and shattered lives. But out of that darkness can come something else. Understanding, reconciliation, peace. Two old men, once enemies, shaking hands in San Francisco and finding they were not so different after all. Families from two nations gathering over a grave to remember together. A world that learned slowly, painfully, that the only way to honor the dead is to make sure their deaths were not in vain, to build a peace worthy of their sacrifice. Today, 79 years after Akatsuki sank, the ship still rests on the ocean floor. Will rest there until the end of time. A monument, a memorial, a reminder. 360 souls still live in that steel tomb, not literally, but in memory, in the stories we tell, in moments like this when we pause to remember. Their war is over. Their suffering ended long ago, but their story continues. As long as we remember, as long we tell their tale, as long as we honor not just the victors, but all who served, all who sacrificed, all who paid the price. Remember them, honor them, learn from them, and may we never forget the true cost of war. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. We will never forget them.